Okay, we will move on then to the conclusion on the DB program, which again is no surprise. The funding is not sufficient based on the current data, methods, and assumptions. Additional contributions are needed. As a matter of fact, as Nick showed you, based on any variety of reasonable assumptions we took, additional contributions would still be needed. There's a $64.5 billion unfunded liability, which is not expected to be funded by the current revenue. It's expected to grow significantly. So the conclusion is the system needs more contributions, which is kind of where we started. Any questions on a big picture perspective on the defined benefit program before we move on to the defined benefit supplemental or the cash balance benefit program?
Paul?
Actually, I had a question back on page 13, where I'm still trying to understand why, if the unfunded liability has gone up, why the contribution rate has gone down. And what I think I heard you say is that for the purposes of measuring the unfunded liability, the $64.5 billion, you are looking at investment returns on the 3-year smoothing. But for the additional revenue needed, that you're not. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. And we obviously we don't really like to do that. But I mean, we spent some time with the board talking about smoothing methods, and I think there's good reasons for it. One is that you're out there comparing, people or, systems are out looking at what your funded ratio is, and everyone else is smoothing. So if you don't smooth, you're going to look way different. And that's kind of the rationale on the funded ratio. And I kind of talked about the rationale on the additional revenue needed is that when we have these huge deferred losses and we're looking for a revenue solution, it's kind of naive to ignore those deferred losses. So that is why we've recognized pretty much all our fair market value when we've done the additional revenue needed. But your comment was exactly correct, and that is why, even though it appears the unfunded went up, the additional revenue needed went down, because if you measured it on a fair market value, the unfunded would have gone down.
Yeah, the unfunded liability is measured with the smoothed assets. This is measured with market assets. And based on the smoothed assets, the funded ratio went down from 71% to 69%, but based on the market assets, the funded ratio went up from 60% to 67%. This is consistent with the market assets. If we were looking at market assets, the unfunded liability would have gotten smaller and the funded ratio would have gotten higher, which means that there's less money needed in terms of future contributions. Two different measures.
That explains the difference. And I think that makes sense. It's just, I think there's, these two numbers are out there and they're counterintuitive to each other is the only thing. And I think as we try to talk about the challenges before the system, it doesn't help to have numbers that take a lot of explanation. And I think these take a lot of explanation, that's all. And despite the fact that might be the right way to do it, but these take a lot of explanation, because I couldn't figure that out until, a lot of...
You're telling the actuary to do something without explaining it.
Well, that's not, it's not clear in this present, it is, if you really look into it, it just, because this table just says current year asset gain, and whereas the other one talks about current year and then the 3-year effect. So it's just...
And again, that's really why we do a very special, lengthy briefing for the media to actually walk through that discussion too. We agree with you that this is tough stuff to reach that differential conclusion, because it is counterintuitive. We had that very discussion ourselves in the communications around this.
And do you think the press then reported it with that degree of
precision? You're cracking up.
I'm not so sure I'd say they did. It's a difficult concept to explain. They certainly seem to focus more on the decline in the funded ratio as opposed to the fact that
The revenue
the
needs.
revenue needed also declined. It's a difficult thing, but I mean I think that the important thing is it is an issue of if we didn't do it on this basis, it would undermine our credibility if as Nick said, if we go down to the capital and say we need a 5% increase in contributions, and then next year you said, oh, actually now it's 8, and the next year actually no, now it's 10, they'll never believe anything we say. So it's a real tough situation trying to deal with trying to explain different things to different audiences.
Right. But isn't there greater volatility with this approach? Because
There would be greater volatility, but at least people would know going in what the real number is. In the long run, that's the right number. Yeah.
I know that
Yeah.
that is the right number.
And if we went to the market value on the valuation itself, you'd see extraordinary volatility in the last several years, and that's the downside of it.
Particularly when there's a $23 billion difference between the actuarial assets and the market assets, we didn't want Ed getting solutions that didn't take that $23 billion into account.
Yeah.
Harry?
Lower the second guessing on it.
Harry?
I appreciate my colleagues asking some of those questions because it improved my understanding of a complicated issue around volatility a little bit more, because it was a new concept that I had not heard of before. It was the first time, and clearly, it's complicated. And so as I look at this, the challenge before us, clearly, rate of types of returns on investment we get it's a significant part of this entire process. The number of people who are retired and are drawing a pension and how long they live is a critical part of this equation. The size of payroll or the lack of pay raises and the increase of payroll, and that's not happening, is a part of this equation. To what extent has the loss of, I think it's about 30,000, and correct me if I'm wrong, about 30,000.
40,000.
40,000.
Since the peak, about 40,000.
We've lost, essentially, we have 40,000 fewer
Less members
Actives.
paid.
active members
yes.
since the recession.
Yes, since the peak a number of years ago, yeah.
So can you speak about, just in a general way, how much that number contributes to this volatility issue? I would assume it has an impact, but is it great? Is it minor?
Yeah, I mean, it's not great, but it definitely increases the volatility.
I mean, one thing we've seen a decrease since the peak, but even before then, the increases had started to slow considerably. So before the recession, the raises, even before the recession, the raises, stopped growing. The population really started to not grow very much. So we went up, but we didn't go up as fast as we were before. And then we hit a peak, and then we just dropped. So, so it's been a gradual increase. It just hasn't increased as fast as the assets, and so we didn't measure the number exactly, so I can't tell you the exact number, but
It's directly proportional to how much lower the payroll is
Right.
than it otherwise would have been, which has two impacts. If instead of having 26 billion in payroll, we have 25 billion in payroll, and we're about 4% less, that does two things. One, it means that any gain or loss is going to have to be paid off as a percent of payroll over a smaller pot. So it's going to be about a 4% bigger or smaller change in contributions. But it also means that any existing unfunded liability has to be paid off over a smaller payroll, which has a direct, immediate impact.
Right.
So you could take the 40,000 members, and if the average pay is 60,000, or is it something in
Yeah, it's like
63,000?
yeah, yes.
59 is
You
what
could take-
59, yeah.
You could take that number and just multiply the 40,000, and then take what the contribution would be, and that's the amount of money that's not going into the system.
Well, plus the fact that it hasn't in the past been increasing, so we'd want to take it over a period of time. So it's not just the drop, it's the fact that we projected increases that haven't occurred. So there's a difference. So there's even a larger difference in what the expected payroll would have been had the assumptions been met, and just the drop. So it's even bigger than that. But it.
So I raised that point for my own, to reassure me that my thinking on the issue also includes the loss of people that are in the system, but also I think to raise the awareness at a broader level that the loss of 40,000 teachers in the state of California is not only bad policy, but it's negatively impacting the ability of this pension fund to deal with long-term challenges.
If we look at it in terms of record count, there are about 400,000 active teachers, so 40,000, if that's the number, is about 10%. That's a large, that's significant. They may have been at the lesser paid range, so it may not be as large a percent of payroll, but that's significant.
Michael?
At the risk of beating this horse to death, would it be possible to modify or to add an additional volatility index that is not based on payroll but is based on participant count? Because I understand how the basing on payroll is good, is easy for employers to understand and how they can use it. I'm not sure that this body, since it does not have jurisdiction or responsibility with respect to contributions, can use this, or I'm not sure how useful this is to us, but I would think that a volatility index that is based on the number of participants in the plan might be. That number tells us, in my mind, it would tell us how changes in earnings or losses have an impact on participants as a whole. I think it still has the same ratio. Because we have a large number of assets, we're going to have the larger the number of assets, the larger the volatility, simply because of a large number of assets. But the larger the number of participants, my guess is that the volatility per participant is going to be different than the volatility based on payroll. And I guess my question is that a formula that you've thought about, that anybody's asked for, that makes sense? Is this something that would be beneficial to us in any capacity? Because I guess because I am somewhat confused as to, I guess the basing it on percentage of payroll, I understand why it's there. I'm not sure why it's beneficial to us.
I mean, really, the point of this is sort of a general thing. I mean, as we talked about, on a plan like CalPERS, I mean, it really directly impacts things every year. But it's just sort of communicate to the board that, because of the assets relative to payroll, that you're going to get increases up and down that are going to be significant. I mean, we're not really looking for any more takeaway than that, I don't think. Oh, sorry.
Let me make one other point. And this is also at CalPERS when they use the volatility index. When you go to your asset liability studies and you want to set asset allocation policy, a lot of systems will say, well, that may be too much. For every 1% loss, that may be too big of a contribution risk. And so maybe we want to change our asset allocation in order to minimize, the probability of a certain percentage loss, because that's too big of an increase in the contributions, and we don't think that we can deal with that. So it is also, partly used when you look at asset and liabilities and you look at your asset allocation studies. So that's another reason why.
And I understand that. That makes sense. And I guess my question is, would it add to the body of information, of quote unquote useful information?
Yeah. Michael, you asked if anyone had proposed that. I have not. The asset volatility index is based on assets divided by payroll. So if I understand correctly what you're saying, well, could we, instead of using assets divided by payroll, could we take assets divided by head count, by the number of actives? I have not we could certainly calculate that first. We could certainly calculate that. I have not heard anyone suggest that. Where the asset volatility index directly came from was the California Actuarial Advisory Panel just in the last year came out with recommended disclosures, which included the volatility index. We didn't make a big deal about it, but we went through our report to make sure that it was consistent with the recommended disclosures. The drawback to using assets divided by record count is that it would not be adjusted for inflation. So we would anticipate that a ratio of assets divided by record count would keep increasing for eternity, that there would be no leveling off as a larger and larger amount of assets, if only with inflation. If the trust assets only grew with inflation, but the record count stayed consistent, then the count index, payroll divided by count, assets divided by count would keep increasing. So it wouldn't level at any point. It'd be harder to compare for 1 year to the next.
I think you're kind of getting into the weeds of how you would calculate it, and that's exactly what you guys do. So,
it's what we do best.
Yeah, and I understand that, but it would help me if you would just think about conceptually whether that whether that index would be helpful. Intuitively, I think it would be.
Well, why don't we come up with some indexes and run them by you?
That'd be great.
Some ideas, and we can certainly do that. We can certainly add that to the report
and if it's not
other
useful,
stuff.
that's fine.
That's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
we can certainly do that. I don't think we have any difficulty with that.
Thank you.
And that goes for other ideas also. But we'll run them all by you guys to see if there are things that you want to include in there.
Brent?
Thanks. Just real quick, I agree that when I first heard of the asset volatility ratio, it's counterintuitive because why is more assets bad? If you're pay-as-you-go, it's probably very less volatile. But I think, at least in California, CalPERS has been using this for about 4 years. I think the employers are starting to get it. I mean, they have a different situation. Their contributions have an immediate effect. And so I don't disagree with coming up with different ways of looking at it, but I think more and more there is some understanding around the index. I don't know if it's an industry standard yet, but certainly in California, people are learning about what it means for contributions.
Yeah, because
If you want,
I'm just trying to find an index that I think we can use, because what are we shooting for? Once we have this number, what are we shooting for? What are we trying to increase it, trying to decrease it? What can we do to do that? And I'm still at a loss as to what we do with this. But I understand the employers use it, and so I have no problem with that. I'm not saying change that, keep it there. But is there additional information based on the factors that you have here that this body might find more useful for everyone?
In terms of what you could do with it, there's really not much the board can do with this aside from change the allocation of the assets to lower the volatility of potential returns in recognition of what the volatility of those potential returns might do to the required contribution rates. From a plan sponsor standpoint, the state could consider what type of a system they actually want to put together that would reach a particular asset volatility index. So you're right that a large part of the consideration, and in CalPERS, the individual employers do have those type of controls. So there's definitely different considerations. Definitely more important to a CalPERS type situation than a CalSTRS type situation.
so I guess my take on it is you just gave us another point of reference to put in our stable of references as we move forward with the unfunded liability. We don't have anybody else in line, and we've had a couple of requests, and I don't want to wait to the very end of the meeting, because some of these pertain to you. So what I've taken so far from our discussion is we've asked for a percentage of payroll needed for a variety of funding levels, and I think we've done some of that in the past. That ought to be fairly easy for you to provide for us, and I think that the board would like that. And then just from our last conversation, some other indexes that you want to play with that we might use as additional points of reference in that stable of references that we have. Was there any other requests just from this discussion so far? Alrighty. This is an action item just to receive the valuation, so I would appreciate a motion. It's been moved and seconded to accept the valuation as of June 30th, 2011. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. We've accepted the valuation. Thank you, gentlemen. And then we're moving on to TRB 121, which is the Defined Benefit Supplement Program. I think that's the next item.
Yes. So we're going to go over the defined.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, before we go there. There is an element that we need to have action on, and that's the finding of the benefits that were, the finding of inadequate funding of the DB program with respect to the benefits that were in effect in June 30th, 2011. We also have that resolution, so I'd entertain a motion.
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion on that? Alrighty, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All right, thank you. Now we're on to defined benefit supplement.
Yeah, we will proceed on to the defined benefit supplement and the cash balance benefit program. We often talk about these two programs together because they are similar programs. In these programs, the participant's benefit is not defined by what percent of pay will be replaced, but by an account balance. So we're going to speak first about the defined benefit supplement program. The majority of those balances were actually accumulated because for a number of years, the 8% of pay employee contribution, 2% of that 8% was being put into the defined benefit supplement program, which built up an account balance for those employees. Now, in addition, currently, the contributions that are going in are any contributions in addition or in excess of full-time pay. For instance, if a teacher works for summer school or does coaching, things over full-time pay, the employee contributions go into the defined benefit supplement plan. Then each year, an interest credit is granted to those balances, which is always at least the minimum interest rate based on the 30-year treasuries. So for the last year, that was 4.5%. In the current year, that's 4.25%. So it's a different type of structure. The cash balance benefit program, which I'll talk about right after this, is for part-time employees. It's very difficult to replace a certain percent of someone's pay if they're working half-time this year, quarter-time next year, three-quarters time the next year. So this type of program works out very well for a part-time employee as well. And for the majority of the part-time employees, what they get is a 4% employee contribution and a 4% employer contribution to the cash balance benefit program. So when we look at these in terms of a valuation standpoint, to determine the financial condition, we compare the fair value of assets. So here we don't have, this should make you happy, we don't have any of those actuarial assets involved in these, only the market value of assets. And we compare that to the actuarial obligation, which is again actuary speak for the total of all those account balances. So we actually look at something which hopefully is more understandable here, the total of those account balances to the market value of assets to find out the funded status. Then there are recommendations based on the board's policy for additional earnings credits or annuity credits, the allocation between those or remaining reserves. This year, we are seeing some very nice results based on the 23.3% return in these programs. The funded status has increased for the defined benefit supplemental program from 86% to 103.6%, and for the cash balance benefit program from 88.3% to 104.7%. These results assume that no additional earnings credits past the minimum interest rate of 4.25% are granted this year. And the increase, again, was due to investment returns. And based on the board's policy, there would be no additional earnings credits this year, meaning that everyone would get a 4.25% interest credit. Looking specifically at the defined benefit supplement program. So I'm going to go through the defined benefit supplement and then the cash balance benefit program. And both of these reports will look almost identical, except that the cash balance benefit program is much smaller, but they'll follow the same track. So the market assets earned 23.3%, which means we got losses both on the actuarial obligation, which means those account balances, and also on the fair value of assets. Really, the overall gain is just based on the fact that when you're in 23%, that's a lot more than the 4.5% that people were granted. So if we were to look at the actuarial obligation, we were expecting those account balances to be worth $8,137 million. Well, that was assuming a 7.25% interest credit. In fact, there was a 4.5% interest credit, which means that they ended up being worth $7,774,000, which made a gain of $363 million. On the asset side, we were expecting to have assets of $7,017 million based on a 7.25% return. 23.3%, quite a bit more. We actually end up with assets of $8,055 million, so that's a gain of $1,038 million, making a total gain of $1,401 million, so that we went from having an unfunded obligation of $1,120 million to actually having a surplus, or I would rather call it a reserve, of $281 million. Now, that's a small surplus. That's about 3.6%. There are no additional earnings credits. There has to be a surplus or a reserve equal to 2 times the minimum interest rate for the following year. Well, that's the year that we're in right now, the year following June 30, 2011. The minimum interest rate, which again is based on the 30-year treasuries that's currently being granted, is 4.25%. No additional earnings credits are granted until the reserve is equal to 2 times that minimum interest rate. So the reserve would have to be at least 8.5%. We'd have to be 108.5% funded to grant an additional earnings credit in excess of the 4.25%. So there's no, according to the policy, there are no additional earnings credits granted this year. Looking ahead, the earnings rate for the DBS program went up from 7.25 to 7.5 to the extent that we earn that 7.5, and it's larger than the 4.25% minimum interest rate will build up a larger reserve. Paul.
Yeah. So the calculation of a surplus of $281 million, I'm trying to understand the use of interest rates. And I'm looking at the TRB 133, where the minimum interest rate is 4.5%. The assumed interest rate for future years is 7.5%. So in coming up with that calculation, are you assuming that the payments that are going to be made in the future are done so on the basis of the 4.5% minimum earnings rate, then discounted back at 7.5%?
We are implicitly assuming that 7.5% interest credits will be earned, but when it comes right down to how we're calculating the actuarial obligation, it's actually simpler than that. I think that the simplest way to look at it is that we're actually summing the account balances which are guaranteed to the individual members. So if there was 2 people who each had an account balance of $1,000, then the actuarial obligation would be $2,000. Now we're assuming that they will earn 7.5% interest credits into the future, which means they would grow a 7.5%. Now I'm getting into the actuary speak part. We're assuming that they will earn 7.5% into the future and then discounting that back at 7.5%, but that ends up where we started.
Yeah, let me just say the rationale. I mean, even though we know, next year maybe it's going to credit 4.5, the rationale for assuming a 7.5% credit is that if you keep earning 7.5%, which what we assume is earned, and you're only crediting, say, 4.5, for example, that eventually you'll start getting a bigger and bigger surplus, and then the board will give additional credits back. So then you'll end up giving back that, which will effectively end up crediting at 7.5%. You follow what I'm saying? Because you'll make up that if you keep earning more than you're crediting, then at some point that crediting has to go up. Because the board's policy is to, when there's a certain amount of surplus, to provide additional credits. So even though, right now it's only 4.5%, at some point in the future, if you keep earning more than you're crediting, the crediting will go up.
Okay.
So from,
I'm trying to.
maybe I can layer on top of that, from a mechanical perspective,
I'm processing.
from a mechanical perspective, from a benefit perspective, one of the most important things it turns out of that 7.5% assumption is that if we have a reserve that's larger than 2 times the minimum interest rate, if we're above 108.5% funded, then the first additional earnings credit goes up to that 7.5%, so we can credit people up to 7.5%, and that's limited. That 7.5% assumption mechanically limits the first earnings credit. There's another threshold past that where larger additional earnings credits can be granted.
Doesn't that then just mechanically mean that we're assuming a 7.5% guarantee? And then this is really no different than the defined benefit plan.
We're assuming they will be granted 7.5%, but in fact, they are not being granted 7.5% when it's below 108.5% funded. Last year, currently, people are only earning 4.25%, so they are not guaranteed a 7.5% return. And that's actually one of the points I want to make here. One reason why these two programs, the DBS and the CBB program, are so well funded is because there's a variability in the benefit structure. The benefits are actually varying based on the investment returns. You know, sometimes, back to that nasty risk word, but sometimes we talk about removing risk by investing in assets which more closely track the liabilities. Bonds. You know, bonds, we know when the coupons will come, we know when the maturities will come. Well, what's happening, an actuary would call that correlating the assets to the liabilities. I'm sorry, I just can't avoid actuary speak. But what happens in these programs is it flips that on its head. We're actually correlating the benefits to the assets, or correlating the liabilities to the assets. The liabilities go up and down to some extent based on actual asset performance. The actual asset performance has to justify a credit larger than the 30-year Treasury bill. And it's not guaranteed. The only thing that's guaranteed is the 30-year Treasury bill return. Nothing in excess of that is guaranteed. The 7.5% is not guaranteed.
Ed?
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that. The guarantee is that they will get a credit equal to the 30-year Treasury rate. The expectation is in the long run, they will get credited what we actually earn on the assets, which we assume right now is 7.5%. But the guarantee is simply they earned a 30-year Treasury rate.
Does that help?
Still processing.
That's okay.
No, but I'm done.
And
I think anybody here would be willing to speak to you, offline or anything to help. So don't feel like everything has to be answered right now, because they'll definitely help you with that.
Yeah, and staff would be very happy to set up any conferences with us and you if that would be helpful, and we'd be very happy to do that.
Pedro?
I just want to make sure, I'm trying to save my voice, but I just want to say something. So basically, all they get is the 3-year guarantee. The 7.5 is what you project, what you use for purposes of determining the funding level, the liability. But reality is reality. The only time that this becomes an issue is if for some reason, God knows when, but the treasuries were at 10% and we're 7.5, then at that point we would then have to give them the 10% and not the 7.5 that we've been projecting. Correct. Because it would get reality. And by giving them 4.5 or 4.25 instead of the 7.5, and if we earn 7.5, I mean that's the idea. We're earning 7.5. That basically just becomes part of the reserve for the rainy days when we don't get there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and that's not quite true, because the board does have the authority and in the past has paid additional earnings credits because that surplus has gotten to a point above the policy. So that the board, so in the long run, we would expect that what gets credited is what we actually earn. But the guarantee is only the 30-year Treasury rate. But they could, in fact, get more, and in the past have gotten more.
All right. Back to you, gentlemen.
All right, so just to wrap that little piece up, so if the actual earnings in a year or long term, if the earnings was 7.5%, but the guarantee was only 4.5%, there's the potential to make up 3% per year. Cash balance benefit program, same story, only smaller. Instead of billions of dollars, we now talk about hundreds of millions of dollars. Again, 23.3% investment return. The gains and losses are for the same reasons. I'm going to go to the bottom line here. The unfunded actuarial obligation was expected to be 16.2 million. Now we're talking about millions, not billions. The actual is now a reserve of 6.8 million, so it's 104.7% funded because there was a $23 million gain. Again, that was caused because the 23.3% return in total was larger than the 4.5% interest credits, which is the accounts didn't go up by 7.5%, or 7.25%. They went up by 4.5%. So, similar to the defined benefit supplemental program, the funded status went up. There was no additional earning credits under the board's policy. If the cash balance benefit program earns 7% as it is anticipated in the future, it would build up a surplus until it was large enough to give additional interest credits. And as Ed was alluding to, we would expect that long term it would be able to grant 7% interest credits, but it's not able to do that until it builds up a reserve or a surplus. Any questions on the cash balance or the defined benefit supplement programs? Because that's essentially the end of those two.
Paul?
Well, I've done a little more processing, and I think I've got my questions, because when you say then pay out an additional earnings credit, what we're doing is we're then, what does that mean, pay it out? Does that actually mean pay it to beneficiaries, or does that, because we stop accumulating a surplus when we get to 110%, right?
Yeah. Both the according to board policy, then you grant up to the assumed return. So you wouldn't just use the whole thing. You would give people a 7.5% or 7%, depending on whether it's the DBS or the CBB plan.
To credit each person's account.
Credit the account.
And then if we had
And
losses
beneficiaries
in the
get
future.
paid also.
I'm sorry?
Beneficiaries would actually get an additional check. Okay.
Okay. And then if we had losses in the future, though, we couldn't, we would never have built up a reserve of more than 10%.
Yeah, and that's the key thing about last year. We were like, say, 85% funded, and we were able to say there wasn't a problem because we know we don't have to credit 7.5%. We only have to credit the 4. So we knew we were going to, we figured we would earn 7.5, but we were only going to credit 4. So we felt that we could make up that difference, and that's where that's why having that lower interest credit works well with having your, if you can earn above your interest credit, that's your buffer against bad experiences that you can. Otherwise, if we only went 10%, if we started giving away benefits when only 10%, only had 110% funded, we'd be a lot more concerned about this policy. But we have the ability that if we drop below 100%, we have this margin to make up the difference. Does that make sense?
It's worth reassessing. We haven't talked about the second step of the board's policy, so we don't usually talk about that because we're not, according to the policy, there are no additional earning credits. But currently, the way it works is that to the extent, let's assume the minimum interest rate is 5%, just because it's easy to talk about. Just say that 30-year T-bills are 5%. Well, then you have to have 110% before you pay out anything. To the extent that you are above 110% funded, you could pay the 7.5% credit. That would be 2.5% above a 5%. But that's all. Only 2.5% until the remaining surplus is equal to 3 times the minimum interest rate.
I'm concerned on the other end. Once we've credited, then what happens if we have some serious losses?
Okay. Those are promises. This program makes a different kind of.
We can go up, but we can't go down.
Correct.
So there is a floor on what beneficiaries would get in terms of the investment return. But the cap is really whatever we earn.
Yeah, there are 2 key promises which make the floor. The first promise is the current account balance. You are promised that you're promised the current account balance, and in addition, the participants are promised that they will be credited at least the 30-year T-bill on top of that. So to the extent that more than the 30-year T-bill is granted in any year, that becomes part of the promise, because then the participant is promised earning the 30-year T-bill, the minimum interest rate, on that now larger base.
Yeah, Paul, there is a floor, and if, for example, God forbid that, you'd earn negative 10% for the next 20 years, then you would have an unfunded problem. You wouldn't be decreasing the account balance of the members.
Right.
So, but,
Okay.
but we do manage it year to year, and so, so far, if as long as we earn a decent interest rate over and above the Treasury, then whatever unfunded gets made up.
There's the potential that if experience was bad enough, the plan sponsor might have to make additional contributions to fund this program. It's interesting to note that even with the dot-com bubble, even with 2008, that did not happen to these two plans because of their benefit structure. It was able to absorb that by crediting lower interest rates than had been assumed.
Any further questions?
No,
Pardon?
If there's no more questions on the CBB or the DBS, I will hand it over to Nick.
Do you want to address these, or you want to go through SBMA?
We'll go through these first. So we do have two resolutions. One's on TRB 159. The second is on 199 to accept or adopt the valuations for the DBS and the CB programs. I'd entertain a motion.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt these. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed nay. Any abstentions? Alrighty, thanks. Now we are on, I think it's TRB 200. $201.
All right, well, I'll start off. We don't have the PowerPoint up yet, but there it is. That's quick. So talking about the supplemental benefits maintenance account, which those of you, I think most of you are aware, that's the one that provides the purchasing power benefits to retirees. We only do this once every other year, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about it. The first thing you'll note right off the bat is that we call this an actual projection instead of an actual valuation, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So as I said, I just want to give you a brief history of the SBMA, just because maybe I'm not sure how often this comes in the DB program. I'm sure you talk about a bit, but the SBMA might get kind of lost in the shuffle. We'll do a comparison to actual valuation projection, talk about the results, and then talk about where we might be looking in the future. All right, so the SBMA, as I said, is a supplemental benefits maintenance account, which is where the assets are held to pay the purchasing power benefits. So what the idea is it restores purchasing power. It's funded by 2.5% annual state contributions, and it's in addition to the 1.5% annual the 2% annual benefit adjustment that is provided to the DB program. So these would be DB program members who have been around, been retired a long time, that would be currently receiving this, and who have a significant loss of purchasing power. So it was at 80%, went to in 2001. It was lower levels before that. So let's just briefly talk about how that's going to work. I mean, if you say inflation is 3% and you're getting a 2% annual benefit adjustment, roughly, it doesn't exactly work out that, but roughly you're kind of losing 1% every year. So if you had at the 80% level, it would probably take roughly 20 years before your purchasing power level, due to inflation, had dropped below, so you could not buy 80% of what you used to be able to, because you also were receiving the COLAs. And at that point, then all of the difference below that is made up. So if you're currently getting a purchasing power benefit and inflation is 5%, then you're going to get a 5% increase in your total benefit. Now, actually, more of it is it's actually be greater than a 5% increase in your purchasing power benefit, but it'll be a 5% increase in your total benefit. So at that point, you stop losing any purchasing power. A couple years ago, the purchasing power level was increased to 85%. The board adopted, after quite a bit of thought, some regulations on how this was going to apply. And basically, what was decided was an 80-year threshold, which actually is a fixed rate of 2,089. So what we look at is we do our analysis. We project the benefits that are going to be paid, the contributions that are going to come in, and the investment earnings. So when we compare our assets that are left and we project them 80 years, and if there's any assets left after 80 years, we say this is okay. Whatever that level of purchasing power is, it's sufficient. So now in evaluation, we try to get the assets equal to liabilities. We don't even calculate liabilities in this analysis. All we do is project the assets forward and come up with that analysis. Now, if at some point the assets are not sufficient and they're going to run out, right now we're at 85%. We can come to the board, and the board can lower that purchasing power level to 84%, 83%. And that might sound like a very small difference going from 85 to 83%, but it has actually a pretty significant impact on benefits. So the board it's like the CBB and the DBS, where the board has some flexibility to adjust benefits to keep the funding appropriate. So moving forward, I think I pretty much already covered all this on that, so I will move forward. Similar to the DB program valuation, we use a lot of the same assumptions. We use the investment return assumption of 7.5. Now, the key thing to note there is that assumption is actually what the SBMA is getting credited. If last year the DB program earned 23%, well, the SBMA did not get 23%. It got actually, I think it was 7 3/4, because that was a prior assumption. So that's what it earned. It earned 7 3/4%, which means that the SBMA program is not subject to that volatility of investment return that the DB program is. Where it is subject to volatility is in the inflation, because the inflation can drive benefits significantly. I mean, if you think back in the 70s, we're having 8% inflation. Well, if you only got a 2% COLA, that would reduce your purchasing power by about 6%, the 8% compared to the 2% annual benefit adjustment. So inflation can drive things. Obviously, inflation's been under control, so that's really helped the funding of the SBMA, which I'll talk about as we go forward. But inflation is the key assumption for this. And then life expectancies, too. The longer people live, the more likely their purchasing power is going to get eroded, and the more likely they're going to need help from the SBMA. So the happy news is the results, and the bottom line is we're going to recommend the purchasing power level remain at 85%, excuse me. This is based on the requirements of the Education Code and the regulations the board has adopted. And the reason for that is the current assets and contributions coming combined with investment returns are projected to be sufficient to cover all benefits over the period till 2089. So what happened compared to last year? Well, inflation was a little bit less, so that helped a little bit. There was the change in assumptions, and you think, well, we lowered our investment return assumption, but once again, it was we also lowered the inflation assumption, which didn't have a big impact on the DB program, but it had a big impact on the had a pretty significant impact on the SBMA. So even though we lowered the investment return assumption, which kind of hurt the SBMA funding, the lowering the inflation assumption actually helped it more. So actually, the change in assumptions actually improved the projected funding of the SBMA. So looking forward, obviously, there is some margin. It's not like 85%. 85% is the maximum level that that is in the Education Code right now. Based on a projection, a slightly higher level could be supported, assuming all of our assumptions came through. And as I said, inflation is the key factor in this. The other ones have a lesser impact. So I think what's sort of interesting is to look at how significant the inflation assumption is. This shows several inflation assumptions if inflation happened like this going forward in the future. And what you see is what the y-axis is the 0, 20, 40, 60, 80. Right now it's about 30. That is the relationship between the assets in the SBMA to the benefits payable right now. So you've got about 30 times as much assets as benefits payable. So that means if you had no investment return and no change in the benefit amount, that it would last 30 years. Obviously, we expect some investment return, and probably the benefits are likely to increase going forward. But but this kind of provides a good barometer of how we'll look going forward. So if our ratio increases, that's going to be an improvement in the projected status. And what you see is that our green line there is our 3%. And as you see, it goes up and then goes down, but ultimately grows going forward. And that means that not only are we projected to have assets, positive assets in 2089, our assets are projected to increase going forward. So that's a very nice finding. But what you see is if we went just to our old assumption of 3.25, under that scenario, there's barely enough at 2089. That just shows how significant just a 0.25% change of inflation assumption is. Now, the thing to remember is the board has the flexibility to lower the benefits from 85 to 80%. So if we did have 3.25, well, take that back. If you look at 3.5, it's projected to run out in about 2050. But the board has the flexibility to lower that 85% down to 84, 83. So then even if we had 3.5% inflation, at some point we would come in and say, hey, it doesn't look like it's projected to be sufficient. Then the board would make an adjustment to the purchasing power level, and then we could still continue to pay the benefits. And even if you ran out of money, you would still pay benefits based on the contributions, but it could be a level that was lower than 80%. But anyway, this just shows the relative impact of the inflation assumption. The low inflation that's occurred recently has obviously really helped the funding. We continue to see that low inflation. Everything looks really good for the SBMA. So bottom line, our recommendation is to retain the 85% purchasing power level, and that concludes our report.
Paul.
Of course, I have a question.
Good, because this is, we've got we've thrown a lot of things at you today.
So I noticed in what you presented here, there weren't like numbers and tables and stuff like that, like there were for the others.
Yes.
Why is that?
It's because this is an actual projection, and all we're doing is trying to find out if we have enough money going forward. This is sort of a translation. That green line is sort of a translation of what we have. I mean, we have assets. Basically what we're doing is we project the assets forward. So that's the contributions, current assets right now, which is a little over $7 billion. In the SBMA, we bring in 2.5% state contributions, add that to the assets, and then take out the benefit payments. And we do that.
7.5%.
Yes, and then we assume 7.5% return. So we project that year each forward. We could do things like we could say, well, this is your actuarial obligation, and compare it to the assets. But the reality is that does not affect what our analysis. The only thing that affects our analysis is this projection.
Paul, under the law, the SBMA benefits are not guaranteed.
Right.
So, but they're guaranteed only to the extent that the money's available. So that's what we measure, the money available to pay.
But in doing so, you're assuming a 7.5% return.
It gets 7.5%. It does.
So where does that money come from if the fund doesn't earn 7.5%?
It comes from the DB program.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Program. So the DB program. So this isn't separate from the DB program.
It is not the funding
program.
Yeah.
The DB program supplements it if the earnings aren't up. And what if they're in excess? Does the excess go to the DB program?
Yes.
Yeah, so the DB program, even though it earned 23.1% overall last year, the actual assets, excluding the SBMA, actually did better than 23.1 because it only had to credit 7.5% to the SBMA.
Yes.
But over the last 10 years, since we only earned 5.5% rather than 7.5%, the DB program has been supplementing the SBMA.
Yeah.
Yes.
And this could become a real concern if the SBMA really grew in size and it had a much bigger impact on the DB program. I mean, right now, it's what's 7 billion versus 140 billion. So it's we're not really worried about that, but it's something we are monitoring.
Yeah, we look at that. I mean, we continue to look at.
And is that by policy, by law, by what says that the SBMA is guaranteed the 7.5%?
It's in statute, actually.
In statute.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
But I would like to say that this was a historic first where you question actuary for having not enough numbers. So, we did.
And it went out
We did.
live, too.
I like numbers.
We did appreciate that.
Ed, did you want to contribute any more to that? Okay. All right, Paul, do you have any further
No,
questions?
that's
All
all.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks. All righty. And we're done with SBMA
Great.
too?
Yes, that is it.
Oh, you guys were so close to lunch. All righty, page 209 is the resolution to adopt the actuarial projection for the SBMA. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. Any abstentions? All righty, we are done with item number 5. We are going to take an hour lunch break.
Dana, I was going to suggest you actually.
Yeah, I was going to that next.
Okay.
15 minutes, you think?
We were just discussing, I think 15 or 20 for your closed session.
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
add another 15 minutes for a closed session. So the board will go to lunch, we'll come back in closed session, we'll reconvene in open session. What? Is that 1:45?
1:45, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds
Yes,
good.
1:45, that'd be perfect.
All
for
right, we'll
going
recess
full
then.
hour.
Thank you.